Thank you for joining us for the next hour or two in this episode of Insight Myanmar podcast. In an age of nearly limitless content, we appreciate that you're choosing to take valuable time out of your day to learn more about what is happening in Myanmar. It's vital for this story to be heard by people around the world, and that starts right now with you.
Okay, welcome back. So, today we're going to be revisiting a topic that we have discussed from different angles in the past, but one that continues to be chronically underaddressed and underanalyzed, and that is the environment. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the impacts that the coup has had on the environment and also the history of the environmental exploitation and the social, political, and economic issues pertaining to that. Um, so, I'd like to welcome you to come to the show. Would you like to introduce yourself for our audience so they know who you are and what you do?
Of course. Hi. Hi, my name is Jack. I I am currently a PhD student at the University College London, but I've been working on issues pertaining to the forest, to mining, to natural resource governance for about 10 years in Myanmar. Um, most of which I've spent in Tenindai region in Dawei, where I've been working with indigenous activists as they've tried to reclaim their lands and their forests from many different threats.
Excellent, excellent. So the topic is obviously phenomenally broad because there are a lot of key sectors going on here. So one of the things that I think needs to be done and needs to be said very early on in the piece, we need to contextualize the scope. So when we talk about environmental exploitation, is there some way that you can sort of put it into an understandable term how large these various industries are in the country, how profitable and therefore how attractive they are to people whose morals are perhaps negotiable?
Yeah, I mean, uh, the kind of exploitation and accumulation which is gathered around Myanmar's natural resources is obviously huge and harks back to the colonial period and before, um, but has continued to sustain many different forms or iterations of military dictatorship. Um, if we're looking at different kind of resources, currently Myanmar contains some of the biggest tin reserves, so is one of the providers of the biggest tin supplies in the world. Has enormous Jade reserves, which have obviously been very high profile. Um, Timber, particularly teak, but also other very valuable hardwoods, um, have sustained um, have sustained decades of military dictatorships, and also was one of the resources that was most sought after during the colonial period. Um, massively significant, both economically and politically. Natural resources are. Um, to Myanmar.
And so, like, is there a way we can put like a dollar amount on the sizes of these industries, so we know like roughly what it is that we're talking about, or are they not formally reported?
There are different kind of figures that we can find, but we can look at the export figures, or sorry, the import figures from other countries, which have been better, which have been documented to a better degree. And some of these to an extent have fluctuated. I have some figures here from 2021 actually. So after the coup, the amount of resources that were exported, and the figures are quite astronomical. Um, so I mean things like altogether with minerals, there was about $3.4 billion worth of exports during that year. $1 billion worth of jade exports, almost $1 billion worth of rare earths, which there's been lots of news coverage about, almost $1 billion worth of tin, 700 million to be precise. Timber has been underreported, and in 2000s and in the 2015, 16, 17, it was estimated to be around 400 million a year, but that's likely a gross underestimation, and the value is probably a lot higher, as a lot of resources go over borders and are accounted for. So it's hard to be precise with the kind of economic figure that we're really looking at.
But I mean, I think it's very important that we sort of look at that, because the numbers that you're talking about are are enormous, and like $1 billion, and that was $1 billion just for jade, which conventionally in the West, like, we understand that jade is expensive. We grasp the concept of that, but our obsession is with these precious stones like diamonds and rubies and sapphires and so on. And I think a lot of people in the West, we look at jade and we think, well, yeah, I know it's valuable, I know it's expensive, I know there are quality differences of jade. But when you look at the actual market for jade, and particularly here, like in Asia, right on the border with China, a huge purchaser of jade, and especially considering that Myanmar's jade is actually jadeite, or has significant jadeite instead of the cheaper nephrite. Understanding that it's literally $1 billion industry just within the scope of Myanmar, like, it really, I think, puts things into a different perspective. And if you look at the country economically, you look at the economic sort of charts that you might find on Wikipedia. Realistically, these sorts of exports don't even make a huge blip. Like, typically, when you look at, okay, what are Myanmar's primary sectors, those sectors tend to be oil and gas. They tend to be agricultural exports, particularly rice, and they tend to be things like textiles. These are the major industries we talk about. And so I think the natural resource exploitation tends to go, unless it's oil and gas, tends to go a little bit underreported and sort of under the radar. Um, so so let's move into specific industries. So I know that one that you have a lot of information on and a lot of strong opinions on is forestry, and not just the industries themselves, but the cultural components, the connection that people have to those forests, and the history that they have with those forests, and the tension that this causes between local groups and corporate. So, what can you tell us about the state of forestry and logging in Myanmar?
Um, yeah, the state of forestry and logging. I mean, the forests in Myanmar have always been a highly contested subject. The majority of forests in Myanmar are located in upland areas in Myanmar's ethnic regions. Um, and as a result, there's always been a lot of conflict. And that conflict is borne out in many different ways. It's not just a conflict over control, but also it's also a conflict over different ways that we understand the forest, different ways we see the forest. So in many upland areas, where indigenous communities reside. People have very deep spiritual relationships with those forests, depend upon those forests for many different reasons. Um, but these forests have also been the site of a lot of exploitation for many years. Um, yeah.
Mm. And so let's talk about the lawfulness here, because there is a very large criminal logging enterprise, which once again I think we often understate. As outside looking in, Western reportage, we don't think of illegally cutting down trees as being a particularly noteworthy criminal enterprise. It seems almost small peanuts, particularly when we contrast it with things like the globally renowned drug trade that flows through Myanmar. But this is actually a very large ecological problem, and also a very large industry financially. So what is driving this illegal logging activity? What's going on with this?
Several different drivers, and one of the primary drivers has been agricultural conversion. So particularly over the last 10, 15 years, during the transition period, there was a significant expansion in a lot of agribusiness activities. So, for example, large expansion of palm oil in the south, banana plantations in the north, and large expansion of rubber too. Um, so the expansion of agriculture or agribusiness is accompanied by what we call conversion timber. So the logging of those areas to make way for that kind of expansion, which has been incredibly lucrative for those involved. So that was one of the primary ways that so much logging took place. In addition to that, we also see different other forms of logging. Some of that is legal, and that's normally done inside reserve forests and public protected forests, which we might consider being, areas where forests are well managed. But these areas have been completely logged out. Many of them have been completely logged out. And then we have kind of smaller forms of logging, which is done through traders, has become increasingly militarized, both in the past and what we can currently see now as well. So we have a few different ways that this takes place.
And so you spoke about this, the conflict and the tension. Like, you speak about the upland areas, so the predominantly ethnic minority, also very likely to be religious minority groups who sort of live on the west and live on the east in the more mountainous regions. And you talk about the connection they have with the forests. So I'm wondering, is the conflict between them and the sort of central government supported exploitation, is the conflict predominantly over financial sort of revenue, the actual right to economically exploit the forests, or is there a deeper sort of cultural desire to preserve this land for the sake of preserving it, and not for any financial purpose, that is being stymied by these centrally supported exploitation industries?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it was a financial conflict. I would say it's probably much more of we can understand it much more as a kind of territorial conflict, and people through different periods of conflict and also land-based investment have lost large areas of their territory. So this becomes a very significant issue for people who depend on their lands and forests. Um, and it's not only kind of logging which has displaced communities, but also from their forests, but also conservation has also been has also been a significant issue. If we look at Kachin, if we look at Tenindai and the other areas of the country too, we see large protected areas, many of which were established during periods of active conflict in the 90s or early 2000s, and have sought to displace thousands and thousands of people from their forests and from their lands. So it's not only a battle over kind of logging and accumulation in this way, but also people being displaced by other processes of forest control, namely conservation.
So hang on, let's talk about this because you said displaced, and that's a very interesting word because it's very open ended. Are we talking about the central government using legal mechanisms to acquire this land? Like in America, this would be called eminent domain. In Australia, this would be called compulsory acquisition. Or are we talking about people coming in and making the region or the territory simply incapable of continuing to sustain those populations and therefore driving them away, not by force of law, but under sort of fear of not being able to survive otherwise? What's the actual mechanism of this dispossession?
Yeah, so interesting. It happens in a couple of different ways, but I think when we think about dispossession in Myanmar, we're looking at a few different processes that are tangled up with armed conflict. And so normally in these areas, communities have been displaced, villages have been destroyed by periods of armed conflict. And it's at this period where people's security of the land is the least, where people have already been displaced, maybe to border areas or cities, planning to come back when the fighting has subsided, that this kind of dispossession takes place. So it's these points that new plans are made for those lands, that either protected areas are established or proposed, or palm oil concessions and other kind of mining or mining operations are established. Um, so in this way, we can kind of see processes of displacement and dispossession working together. And these processes of dispossession are normally done through legal processes. They have, recognition through law, something that the communities who've been displaced have never had. And so coming back and establishing a life in the territory that has always been yours becomes something that's very difficult.
Interesting. And so it's interesting that there seems to be this consistent overlap between conflict zones and the environmental exploitation. And it sort of it points to this interesting, we might call it a coincidence, but it is the more mountainous regions that have the predominantly sort of ethnic minority populations and the religious minority populations, whereas the central lowlands of Myanmar are predominantly ethnic Burma, predominantly Buddhist. And it is in these mountainous regions where we tend to find the best forests, where we tend to find the greatest concentration of natural resources. The jade industry itself is very strong in the far north, as are a lot of the rare earth industries in Kachin State. Is it the case that it's just by coincidence that the mountainous regions were more difficult to conquer and also are naturally geographically more abundant with natural resources, and so it's just an unfortunate coincidence that the ethnic minorities found themselves on the most valuable resource-laden land? Or is it that there are resources within the predominantly Bamar region as well, and the government does not treat those populations with the same degree of enmity?
I think that there's both components at play. So to some degree, the fact that upland areas have the least infrastructure has kind of protected various areas from a lot of accumulation. So forests still stand, but also there's a lot of geological and geographical reasons why there would be more resources in areas where there are, mountains and hills, which because of, different because of tectonic plates coming together, etc. We find greater kind of resources like gold and rubies, and this is also a reason why there's much more resources in these areas. Um, and also in the lowland regions, there's also been um, a longer history of sedentarized agriculture, which has also meant that there's been uh, further deforestation. Yeah, so there's a few different reasons there.
Interesting. So, but again, it does come back to this idea of the ethnic conflicts and the same conflicts that have been bubbling for decades and decades and decades, which have been described variously as well. These are inter-ethnic conflicts, these are territorial disputes, these are religious conflicts, these are whatever. There is this large economic component as well that is often sort of put to the side in the interest of simplifying the conflict into, oh well, this is an ethno-religious conflict, and evidently there's significantly more going on at play, and then there's significantly more going on in those territories that brings a lot of actors to the table who might not care about the ethno-religious components of the conflict in the first place. But yeah, so okay, so let's move sort of down from the forests. So let's move to the more um, conventional, so non renewable types of resources, minerals and metals and things of that kind. Um, so you spoke about, when we discussed this before, you spoke about an expansion of mining operations across the country. What types of mining operations are we looking at expanding, and what is driving that expansion?
Um, so there's been expansion of a few different types of mining, but when we're looking at the expansion of mining, mainly we're looking at mining that can be done pretty quickly. So kind of smash and grab style mining. So we've seen a massive expansion of gold mining, particularly in Kachin State, but across the country we can see quite a large expansion, um, as well as tin mining. Also seen large expansions in the south. Um, Probably these two, the main commodities which there's been a huge expansion of. And the reasons for the expansion, I suppose, are several. One, one is the economic collapse, which has meant that many people are involving themselves in these mining industries. So it's become an important livelihood for many people who've lost other livelihood sources. Um, the conflict has also been a driver of of um, of this expansion of mining as the military and other armed groups um, want to generate more resources for the conflict. Um, we can see that the kind of breakdown in any sense of accountability, any kind of rule of law, has also meant that there's been an expansion um, in the mining sector. So we can see that the mining sector has become even more militarized than it was before. There are very few constraints to people who have got the backing of arms to doing mining. So there's a few different reasons why it's expanded so rapidly during this period, why it's taken the shape that it has.
And I mean, obviously, there's quite a bit of foreshadowing going on there when we're talking about the absence of oversight and regulation. Um, let's look at a couple of sort of key elements here. So, gold mining, as we spoke about previously, um, I was horrified to discover that a practice that I knew existed in some countries, but I didn't think actually existed in Asia, is being utilized, which is the use of mercury in gold extraction. Can you take us through that phenomenon and how that came about?
Yeah. So there's a few different processes that people use for the extraction of gold. And Myanmar has a few different kinds of gold deposits. They have in the center of the country primary gold deposits, which are contained within hard rock. So we generally call it hard rock mining, which people need cyanide to extract. So the gold is purified and amalgamated in this kind of mining through cyanide. But the majority of gold mining in Myanmar is from alluvial sources or secondary sources, which are normally found in sedimentary rocks along riverbanks, in soft soil. And these people generally use mercury as the way to amalgamate and recover the gold. And so miners, after kind of displacing areas with sedimentary rock, will use mercury to amalgamate different particles of gold together, and then burn that amalgam in order to purify the gold and be able to recover gold that they can sell. Um, and Mercury has many significant health harms. It's incredibly dangerous neurotoxin, and so it is both really damaging to the people who use it, but also to the ecosystem around, as it kind of bioaccumulates up the food system and finds its way into the bodies of fish and birds, etc.
Because of course you said specifically alluvial, and if I'm not mistaken, alluvial refers to riverbeds. So this is places near bodies of water. So the risk of contaminating sea life and therefore seafood is particularly high, significantly higher than if this were far away somewhere in the mountains.
Yeah. So mainly kind of riverine areas. So I think that there has been some studies done actually, but there's huge amounts of mercury contained in fish that can be found in rivers and streams.
And so the question, because the process itself, like you talk about the amalgamation, and so from a chemical perspective, gold is found in rocks, it's found in ore, and conventionally we would smelt it, we would melt something, and then we would extract the liquid and purify it. But in this case, we can just dunk it into mercury, and because of the chemical properties of mercury, the metallic gold will simply be extracted into that mercury mixture, and we can throw the rock away. This seems reasonably simple and straightforward. Is this a practice that is used in more developed, professional, safe mining operations, or has this just been phased out everywhere else?
I think that the majority of mercury is used in artisanal and small scale mining. So that probably, and that's across the world. So that's the biggest use of mercury as well. And so I think that probably kind of replicates or kind of mirrors the mining sector or gold mining sector in Myanmar, much of which is small scale and artisanal, even if it's running at a larger kind of acreage, is going to be kind of use relatively basic levels of equipment.
So this is
So
not just the large scale mine. This is not the small scale people saying, "Well, this is what all the big mining operations are doing. Let's try to emulate them." The big mining operations aren't even doing this to start with.
um, the big mining operations in Myanmar will be using mercury, yeah, if they're running from alluvial sources. So if they're mining from sedimentary rock, if they're mining from hard rock, they'll be using cyanide.
Wow. Okay. So large scale, small scale, they are using these dangerous substances.
Yes, yeah.
And is there a way that they can use these dangerous substances? Because in the absolute most primitive form, we soak the ore in the mercury, the gold amalgamates into the mercury mixture, and then you can literally just heat the mercury until the mercury evaporates off and extract the gold. You can do that, creating a large cloud of very dangerous neurotoxin metal. Is there a safe version of this? Does that exist, or is it always risky?
There is there's been kind of lots of different efforts to make safer versions. But I don't think that any of them have been necessarily kind of accessible or maybe feasible enough to really catch on. So in bigger, more professional mining operations, you might find people using kind of funnel-like contraptions to capture the smoke, um, so it doesn't harm the people who are using it. Um, and you might find kind of more safe protocols for using it, um, but by and large, it kind of remains the same. There's been, I think you alluded to it. There's been some efforts to do kind of direct smelting without using mercury, but I think that it's not really, to my knowledge, it's not been a practice which has really caught on in many places because I think it's pretty difficult to do, and the function that mercury plays in the kind of gold mining process is quite an important one. Um, People do say that using cyanide it is safer because it can break down, which sounds funny, but because it can break down into the ecosystem, whereas mercury stays there forever.
I mean, that's, and again, like the heavy metal poisoning, like mercury, lead, cadmium. We've seen this. We've been through this. Like we went through this even in the late 20th century, um, which I mean was when I was born. So that's as far back as I can remember. I don't know if it was even earlier than that. But we were talking about, hey, you can't have the fish from the bay. You can't have the fish from the region around this mining town, because the quantity of heavy metals that have built up in the sea life in that region have made the fish positively poisonous to you to eat. You will slowly develop degenerative neurological conditions as a result of eating the seafood. And we came to terms with the fact that industrial processes are turning our food sources into poison. Um, so it's happening in Myanmar. One has to assume that they're conscious of the risk. Is this just a case of people being so desperate because they have no alternative that they'll just roll those dice and live with decades of consequence, or is there some sort of propaganda campaign to convince the people that mercury and cyanide are not as dangerous as they're cracked up to be?
Um, I think that people aren't very aware, generally, who use those substances, quite how dangerous they are. And also, the kind of danger of them is displaced because it would take several years to be able to see the impacts. It's a kind of, they say, slow violence. So for that reason, I think that because it doesn't impact people straight away. There's no necessarily strong impulse for people to stop handling or to use safer practices. And I think that the level of awareness it's very low, I think.
I mean, it makes sense. It's just very unfortunate. And where how are they getting the mercury? Someone must be selling the mercury to them. Myanmar does not produce mercury. Are there international controls on these dangerous substances? Like, does nobody verify that it's not going to be used to poison rivers?
I think that the majority of mercury is produced from China, and I think that some might also be produced in India as well. Um, and so it comes in very informal ways. So I don't think that it's internationally tracked. And then normally it's held by gold traders or gold shops, where people uh, go to sell their gold. So it's very easy to acquire.
Okay. So so there's no real checking. It's not just that like a bunch of bad actors are trying to dump their mercury because they can no longer use it in their industries. It's more just the Myanmar people are willing to buy and other people are willing to sell.
Mm, that's
Fair
right.
enough. Fair enough. So it's moving away from that. So let's move to a similar case. Up in the north, in Kachin, um, we did an episode talking about this, but I think it's worth recapping on this. Um, terbium, if I remember the name correctly, and the element next to terbium, dysprosium, I think. Both very very rare metals. Both of them are crucial to manufacturing of high tech goods, including phones and smart goods and electric vehicles and so on, and largely being mined in Kachin State once again through very dangerous chemicals that are being pumped into the mines and that then seep into the natural environment. Do you have any sort of scope for this type of activity? Not just mercury and gold, but the rare earth industry in general in Myanmar and the ecological impacts that industry is having.
Yeah, I mean, rare earth mining is concentrated in Chimpwe in Kachin State, and it seems that the both the ecological and also the kind of human impacts have been really significant, um, and this kind of I guess this is a kind of a process of what is known sometimes as slow violence, the pollution that comes from these kind of mining operations, um, where the impacts are felt for generations afterwards. And so I know that in rare earth operations, people um, have faced many health difficulties, lots of miscarriages, um, lots of disfigurations and things like this. So it's very serious.
Yeah. So okay, so let's move forward then. So we've looked at forestry, we've looked at jade, we've looked at rare earth metals and gold and the expansion of mining operations. So this is something that has been going on for a very long time. This is something that particularly the ethnic and religious minority communities have been dealing with for decades, and has led to armed conflict, as we've discussed. Now, obviously, February 2021, we see the coup, and the country sort of descends into basically border to border violence. What has the impact been since then? As the dust has not even begun to settle, the dust is very much still churning in the air. What has been the impact on all of these different sectors and industries?
Yeah, I mean, we spoke about it a little bit before, but we kind of see a transformation of lots of these kind of resource sectors. Um, the the last period, the period of liberalization, democratic transition, um, we saw kind of large land-based investments, large-scale projects, very kind of like, huge dam projects being proposed and things like this. And I guess that kind of symbolized a kind of investment environment that different kind of people who wanted to uh, accumulate wealth from Myanmar's natural resources and natural features were interested in. But now there's been quite a rapid transformation of that. And obviously, lots of those kind of large scale projects have been either put on hold, investors kind of walked away. But we see a kind of different kind of forms of extraction in the current period. And these kind of forms of extraction are pretty rapid, often smaller scale, with less levels of investment, but in many ways more ubiquitous, and so have a different set of damages. And alongside that, also we see that because of the nature of the resource extraction in the current period, um, uh, there's very few regulations, and so the environmental consequences are really dire. So we hear lots of communities talking about rivers drying up, talking about the expansion of mines into their villages, sometimes displacing whole communities. We see rapid expansion of mining into IDP villages, so absentee villages, which has happened in the past, but is happening now. And while we look at this kind of I don't know if we could call it conflict capitalism, when we look at this kind of period, we also should look at what might come next. And what we can see from cycles of conflict in Myanmar with their relationship to land and resource exploitation and appropriation, is that following conflict, I think we talked about this process earlier. Following conflict and displacement, we start to see more forms of dispossession. And so the more villages who are displaced, I mean, we know that 1.5 million people have been displaced, so absolutely enormous levels of displacement. We can start to see, I'm sure that we'll start to see more larger scale resource extraction in areas of displacement, as it opens up new land and new opportunities for capitalists to start exploiting.
Absolutely. And so it is quite weird, and we're seeing a lot of different things. Obviously, we're seeing, you know, the petrochemical industry, which is not something that we've really um, focused much on, but we've seen a lot of that Western investment pulling out already, and there will certainly be someone to fill that gap one way or another. You know, if there's a opportunity, there's an opportunity, someone's going to take it. Um, but so the ramifications, though, these industries, whether or not there's a lull, the ramifications, the environmental impacts of these industries and the environmental impacts of the actions that have already been taken over the last, you know, years or decades continue on, because we're not just looking for scaling back of activities, but they positively require efforts to undo the ecological damage. And is there any estimate, by the way, like with regard to the ecological damage, is there any figure that we can put on what it would take and how long it would take to try and replenish the environments that have been damaged by these industries that don't conform to sort of safety standards or environmental protection standards?
You mean in the last 2 years?
No, I mean in the last like 50 years.
In Myanmar?
Yes.
I haven't seen any data or research like that, but it would be
Okay.
very interested to know.
Because that I mean that would really be the question, because it's not just about stopping a bad industry. Like if the mercury is already in the water, can that be repaired? Like, is there any way to try and industrially extract the mercury?
Um, I think it would require people to scour riverbeds and things like this. So it would be something that would be a very, very big operation and very, very difficult. Um, yeah, so not something easy to do. No.
Hmm. So, okay, so basically, the overarching point that I want us to focus on is what are these impacts? What are we looking at in the long term? Because coup no coup, trees have to grow, animals have to eat, water flows downstream. These are just things that are true. Um, what is Myanmar looking at currently in terms of an ecological future? What are we headed towards?
Well, potentially it's very, very bleak. Um, we can see over the past 2 years, there's been pretty rapid deforestation in many areas, large expansions of gold mining, and I, it's very difficult um, to see a point in the future where we can start to think about what recovery would look like. But I think it highlights a really important point, and that's the kind of relationship between ecological collapse, between, if we're looking at a bigger scale, between climate change, extinction, and things like this, on the relationship between that and kind of conflict and authoritarianism, closing civic space, and how disastrous these are for not just for people, but also for the environment and of course the people who depend on that environment. Um, and these, as we can see with the coup, this kind of just pushes us more towards the precipice of climate and ecological collapse across the world too.
As a, like, I want to talk about that one as well, the long term ramifications. But focusing internally, focusing within Myanmar, um, you spoke before about desertification. What would that actually look like in the case of Myanmar, or where is this occurring? Like it's not some deserts are not something that we conventionally associate with Southeast Asia. It almost seems a contradiction in terms. So what does desertification look like in the Myanmar context?
Yeah, so I mean, Myanmar, I mean, amid many different kinds of refugees and IDPs who've fled from conflict, we also have a really large number a very large number of climate refugees, many of whom come from the dry zone, whose land just doesn't really provide the things that it used to anymore, whose land had become really desertified as climate change has intensified. People who can't grow the crops that they were growing before and can't make a living anymore, and kind of become migrants throughout the country, displaced because of ecological collapse. Um, and so the kind of intensification of climate change and the drawing back of rainy seasons, and as rainy seasons become smaller, but sometimes more, there's more periods of intense rain too. It just means that there are large areas in the dry zone which just become untenable. Um, so this is what it looks like. It is obviously hugely serious, but something that's been going on for a very long time. I mean, we also see a kind of inverse or similar processes that have taken place in the Delta, and obviously after Cyclone Nargis. But what happened afterwards was that so much of the land became salinated that people couldn't grow things there either, and also become a different kind of climate refugee.
So the delta, I mean, delta regions are typically quite. For I don't know specifically what Ayeyarwady is like, but delta regions tend to be very fertile areas where you have uncharacteristically large agricultural output. Was that historically the case in Ayeyarwady?
It was one of the central rice bowls, but livelihoods there have become increasingly difficult, largely because of the salination of the soil, which just means that it's very, very difficult to grow things like it was in the past, and also changing climate has also made this very difficult too.
But so salination, you mean salt? There's salt in the
Yes,
soil.
that's right. That's right. Yeah.
How did that get there?
Um, uh, I think it got there through the cyclone and through rising sea levels that have washed up. So that has resulted in salt getting into the land.
So, okay. So, in terms of food, Myanmar has been like a rice exporter. That they export rice, and we know, for example, that the red soil in Shan State is famous for its fertility and the nutrients that it imparts to the rice and all that sort of stuff. Myanmar has not had a problem, to my knowledge, feeding its population, or at least not an ecological problem. Political problems, yes, but not an actual incapability of feeding the population. Is that a potential future for Myanmar, simply not being able to produce enough food?
Yeah, I think it's a very real problem. And uh, I'm just thinking of examples to give. Even now, we find that lots of food in Myanmar is imported, and lots of people have stopped producing food, which sounds kind of funny, but lots of people have moved towards cash crops. So we see lots of people cultivating betel nut in the south or rubber, have moved away from food production, which puts people in a very, very vulnerable position. So, in the south, where I've the, the majority of my experience has been, um, a huge majority of the food that's brought into the markets is not from Myanmar, it's from Thailand, which obviously puts people in a very precarious situation. So the potential of Myanmar losing its food sovereignty and food production because of climate change, but also because of the different incentives of what people are producing, is a very real one.
And so that what you just said there, it reminds me of a couple of other cases. It reminds me of, for example, Yemen, who before the war saw some phenomenally high percentage of what little arable land they had dedicated to the cultivation of khat, which is like betel nut, a chewable narcotic. Colombia, where drug lords are forcing farmers to grow cocaine instead of growing other types of crops, and perhaps sort of most famously Haiti during the French colonial period, where every inch of arable land was converted into sugarcane crop. And of course, the ramifications of these often are not only that there isn't an established industry of food manufacture, but also that the soil deteriorates. Very notable in the case of cocaine, where after fields have been used for cocaine, that those fields often will not support conventional agricultural industries in the future. Is that a similar thing when we're talking about rubber plantations? We're talking about betel nut. Do they have deleterious effects on the soil itself?
I think that they do. They do diminish the soil and its nutrients, so it becomes very difficult to plant things afterwards. Of course, also other kinds of agribusiness as well use lots of toxic chemicals, which means that the land would be very difficult to cultivate afterwards. And also, this is also common with the other kinds of pollution that we were talking about earlier as well. Uh, Pollution from mine tailings and mine waste also feed into people's soil and mean that lots of land has become unarable. So there's lots of pressures on agricultural lands, which would undermine some of the food systems that people have. Yeah.
And so taking that and now expanding to a broader context, because again, people tend to underestimate um, scope and size. And Myanmar is larger than Ukraine, and Ukraine is the largest country wholly within Europe. Obviously, if we're not counting Russia because it's transcontinental. But Myanmar is some 30,000 square miles larger, something in that vicinity. So it is a huge slice of the planet. What are the impacts globally for what we're seeing? Because we can't expect environmental and ecological damage to be contained. Disasters do not care about borders. What are the potential flow-on effects?
I mean, potentially huge. Myanmar has some of the largest, continues to have some of the largest contiguous rainforests in Southeast Asia. These, in many ways, are at peril. It's a country which is incredibly important for the for 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 maintaining a balanced ecosystem and climate in many ways. But lots of these ecosystems are in peril, which has huge global implications. The destruction of Myanmar's forests would have huge knock-on effects for both for climate change, but also for extinction, because many of those forests contain very vulnerable and endangered species. So when we look in the global sense, I mean, we can kind of see that the issues in Myanmar are not just national but international, and also, and it's very critical to think that the resolution of the conflict in Myanmar has huge global ramifications. And also, as I think we spoke about a little bit earlier, there's a very important relationship between conflicts and between climate change. And if we're really serious about addressing the existential issues that face us all, we really need to start looking at cases like Myanmar, in which we will see, in the next few years, very serious ecological issues which are going to be irresolvable. Yeah.
Yeah. So bringing this then back to the coup, which seems to sort of underlie everything that happens in Myanmar these days. This conflict has been going on for 2 years, and there is clearly no immediate end in sight. And on top of all of the things that we've already discussed, the actual sort of ecological damage being caused by industrial processes, and um, the choices with crops and things like that, we've now got agricultural land that is being deliberately burnt or shelled, regions that are effectively being denied by virtue of unexploded ordnance, and settlements that are being burnt to the ground, and of course the IDPs and other types of refugees have gone through the roof, as you've noted. Um, it's I'm just wondering, like, how much worse do you think this can get? Like, are we looking at just the same thing just continuing onwards, or is it going to snowball? Is this going to just not just get worse, but get worse at a significantly increasing pace? How long until we hit a critical point?
Um, I think in many other ways that we look at Myanmar, it's very difficult to see where a resolution will come at the current point in time. But on the current trajectory, I think things will become significantly worse. Um, I think that the kind of scale of ecological collapse, both from many different directions, both because of the economic outlook, so people relying more on on mining and other resource-based activities, conflict, which is feeding resource use, this displacement of indigenous communities who protected their lands for decades or for generations, sorry. I mean, all of these things really paint a very, very bleak picture. Yeah, so I don't know when a breaking point or a critical point will come. It's really difficult to say. But but unless something changes quickly, I'm sure we'll reach it quite, we'll reach it probably sooner than we expect.
And then, I mean, I suspect, being cynical, I suspect that I already know the answer to this question, but is there anything that we outside of the country can do in order to ameliorate this situation?
I think that I think that we need to change the ways that we think about the situation and the ways in which the situation has been perpetuated. And a lot of the conversation that we've had, we've looked at the kind of the financial value of lots of different resources, and it's this kind of system of internal but also international capitalism which has continued to prop up successive military governments. Um, and so by addressing this and also globalizing the issue and starting to think about about the ways in which the coup in Myanmar and the dictatorship in Myanmar impacts our global efforts to contain climate change. I think we need to start thinking in these ways and thinking a lot larger. The more that we think that issues in Myanmar are just national, contained between national borders, I think it's very difficult to be able to find roots out. Um, what are the other things that we can do, us as individuals? Very difficult, but I would, continue supporting uh, communities and people who are trying their best to rid themselves of this tyrannical regime. I think that's the best thing I can think. Yeah.
Fair enough. Um, yeah, so I think we've covered quite a lot of ground here, and I want to thank you for coming on. But before we finish up, by tradition, we would always leave the guest with a bit of time to give the audience some thoughts to mull over, or just the key salient points that you want people to sort of go away humming as they leave this interview. So I'd like to just invite you to share some thoughts with us along those lines.
Mm. Um, yeah. I guess I have a few thoughts. I mean, maybe just to reiterate on those last few points that we just discussed, and thinking about how capitalism, how resource exploitation and appropriation has continues to perpetuate struggles, I think is really, really important and a subject that we need to discuss more. Also, the kind of larger uh, issues that we've discussed today about environmental collapse and kind of environmental impacts of the coup. This has been something which has, we've through particular cases we've come to, but it's been something that's been widely underreported actually. And so I think having more attention on this space is really, really critical because it's really, really important and the outlook is incredibly bleak. And it plays, in many ways, a very, very important role in the conflict. So this is something that I think we should all think about a little bit more. Um, uh, and then I guess finally, I would maybe like to pay homage as well to the many indigenous communities who I've had the privilege of working towards, who are continuing to struggle to protect their lands and forests in the face of such difficult circumstances, and in the face of expanding conflict, of displacement, of dispossession. But people are still working incredibly hard to protect their lands and their forests. And so we need to be able to find ways to support them as best as we can. I think probably those are my final thoughts.
Many of you know that in addition to running the Insight Myanmar podcast platform, we also formed a nonprofit, Better Burma, to respond to the terror that the Burmese military has been inflicting on the country and its people. We encourage listeners to check out our blog to see what work Better Burma has been carrying out, along with the upcoming projects we hope to support. Right now, as I'm sure you all know, and today's interview only reinforced, that the ongoing need is overwhelming. A donation of any amount goes towards those vulnerable communities who need it most, and it will be so greatly appreciated. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give in another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam